The first time, well, any time that I walk into the cathedral at the center of Milan, I go quiet. Everybody does. It's a pretty common experience when entering a sacred place like this. It inspires a sense of awe. There's something about the way that the light moves through the space, the smells, the sounds, the sheer scale of the space. It overwhelms anybody that walks in it. It's impossible to identify or point to any one aspect of this building that actually provokes this feeling. I'm not even sure I can articulate what that response is, like what that feeling is, but we're gonna try to anyway. Like, I can identify other moments when I've felt something similar. That's actually pretty easy to do. I've felt overwhelmed in a similar way while watching a musical, when the staging, the words, the quality of the voices all combine to produce something greater than the sum of their parts. I've felt it while sitting in front of a painting by Peter Bruegel at the Met, and I've felt it while dancing at a Carly Rae Jepsen concert. I definitely felt it the third time that I read Hamlet. The third time hits really hard for some reason. And I get it, those moments don't seem to have a lot in common, but they all do share this ineffable quality that feels almost spiritual, like I'm fully connected to something, fully present. It's an impulse that for me, it usually comes accompanied with the will to say something totally inadequate, like, this is just so good. It's the impulse to share something, an idea or a state of mind, but unsure of what that thing that I even want to share is. I just know that I want to tell somebody about it because I think that if I could just explain it, I could find my way back to it. And in this search for a way to describe these experiences, the best vocabulary that I've found comes from a branch of art theory called Pragmatist Aesthetics. The goal of this philosophic tradition is to redefine art in such a way that we could have more of these powerful experiences in our lives. And if learning about art theory and trying to have better experiences with art sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing and checking out my Patreon. As you might expect, Pragmatist Aesthetics is built on top of Pragmatism, a branch of philosophy that posits that the truth or meaning of any concept is not fixed, but can be understood by how useful it is, by what that belief does or how it operates within human experience. I find it useful to compare this view of knowledge to other philosophies to get a clearer picture of it. In the philosophy of Plato, for example, the physical world that we interact with every day is fragile. It changes, corrodes, it's transitory. But the world of ideas is permanent. A real tree will eventually die and rot into the ground, but the idea of a tree is eternal. Plato believed that what we perceive in the world is simply a shadow or an imperfect copy of a higher truth that exists in the realm of ideas or forms, and that we can access truth through the contemplation of those forms. We know that something is a chair or whatever because we have the ideal form of a chair in our heads, and if something in our lived experience of the world corresponds sufficiently with the idea of a chair that we have in our heads, then we understand that object to be a chair. The physical chair is temporary, flawed. The ideal chair is forever. For Plato, real knowledge comes from the study of these ideal forms. It's why he liked math so much. If you study ideal triangles in the world of maths, you can better understand the triangles that help support the roof over your head. So for Plato, our lived sensory experience of the world is only ever an imperfect copy of real knowledge. It's not worth our time. We need to use our intellect to access the real, capital T, truth. Pragmatism rejects that premise. Philosophers like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey didn't just reject the idea that capital T truth exists in the realm of forms, they rejected the idea that humans can ever access capital T truth through any process. The only way that we can know anything is through our experience, and our experiences are not static. Therefore, truth cannot be static. Our interaction with the world constantly changes the world, and this new world that we helped create in turn changes us. Truth can therefore never be stable. It's something that we are always in the process of creating. So for a pragmatist, a belief is true if that belief helps us navigate the world or solve a problem, if it proves useful. Another way to think about this is that for a pragmatist, truth is not a thing that we discover, it's a tool that we use to navigate our experience, and as our experience changes, the tool itself needs to change. And so what does all this have to do with art? Well, if you're a Platonist, then art is simply an imperfect copy of a sensory experience that is already an imperfect copy. Platonists famously had very little regard for the arts, believing that art can't do anything that philosophy can't do better. And if you're a pragmatist, then art is not just an imitation of reality or a lesser reflection of an ideal form. It's a dynamic, lived experience that actively shapes our understanding of the world. If our experiences influence our knowledge, then having powerful, focused experiences can expand that toolbox of truth. Art can provide those powerful, focused experiences. For a pragmatist, art isn't about capturing static truth because truth isn't static. It's a way of thoughtfully engaging with life. It provokes new thoughts. It's a way to engage with new perspectives and expand one's scope of experience. Moreover, since our experience and the world are themselves always in flux, the meaning of any given work of art is just as fluid. A piece of art can't have a single, unchanging interpretation or purpose. Instead, the significance of a work of art evolves as it interacts with different audiences, contexts, and times. When the movie Reality Bites came out, every 20-something in 1994 believed that Winona Ryder should end up with Ethan Hawke. Now we all know that Ben Stiller was the better option. Or, for a more classic example, we can consider how Michelangelo's statue of David has changed meaning over time. The statue was originally commissioned to adorn the top of the Florence Cathedral in a distinctly religious context with religious meaning. But once it was finished, the city of Florence decided to place it outside their center of government, the Palazzo della Signoria. When the statue moved from its religious setting to the political setting, it changed meaning. It became a symbol of the little Florentine republic standing up against the Goliath banking families and surrounding autocracies that threatened its freedom. The context changed the statue's meaning. John Dewey, in Art as Experience, the founding text of Pragmatist Aesthetics, talks a lot about the work of art in a literal sense. The work of art is not the object, but the work that the object does in whatever context it finds itself. This might be something straightforward, like it might inspire joy or provoke backlash or make people laugh. But the work an object does might be more subtle than that. It could reinforce cultural narratives, or create a shared vision of history, or reinforce power structures. Or it could do the exact opposite. It could disrupt cultural narratives, revise history, or serve as a site of resistance. The point is, art does work in the world by shaping experience. If we think about art in this way, then the question, what is art, becomes impossible to answer. The definition would need to constantly change to accommodate different contexts and different experiences. A much better question would be, when is art? Or when do we see art do its work? Like, do we see it work at museums? Maybe, sometimes. But this brings us to a key feature of Dewey's Pragmatist Aesthetics. He doesn't like museums very much. A popular opinion might be that art is something that happens in a museum, or a gallery, or a theater, or someplace like that. A special place reserved for the arts. Because of this, often we think about art as something removed from everyday life, something that happens at or in these special places like a museum. But of course that's not true. Humans have been producing art since before the agricultural revolution, and museums, they're just not that old. So clearly humans do not need museums or galleries to have or make art. This compartmentalization of art as something that happens only in these special locations, it's a modern invention that simply can't be the full story. Art doesn't need museums, but life does, and art wasn't always confined to those museum spaces. Dewey explains that in the past, even in the caves, human habitations were adorned with colored pictures that kept alive to the senses experiences with the animals that were so closely bound with the lives of humans. But the arts of the drama, music, painting, and architecture thus exemplified had no peculiar connection with theaters, galleries, museums. They were part of the significant life of an organized community. And that's an interesting point. The places people lived or organically gathered in the past were adorned with artwork, like people gather organically in the Italian piazza outside of a church. People would go to the English churchyard to celebrate anything that needed celebrating. These were community spaces, and they were also filled with art. Religious structures like temples or churches served as social centers for medieval communities and reflected the values and purposes of those spaces within those communities that they served. For example, in Europe before the late 16th century, plays were performed in public squares or communal land, notably not relegated to theaters. You didn't need to set out to go to a theater in order to see a play. Music and dancing were built into the rituals of religious practice, and religious practice was part of the rhythm of the day or week or year. Art was a part of the landscape. Artistic production and experience was connected to daily life, not segregated from it and placed in a museum. So what happened? Why don't we have more art in our daily experience with life? Why don't we find more art experiences integrated into our normal days? Well, Dewey attributes this to the 1-2 punch of imperialism and capitalism. So let's take those one by one. He associates museums with imperialism because, as he says, every capital must have its own museum of painting, sculpture, etc., devoted in part to exhibiting the greatness of its artistic past and in other part to exhibiting the loot gathered by its monarchs in conquest of other nations. For instance, the accumulation of the spoils of Napoleon that are in the Louvre. Museums frequently create a narrative that supports and promotes national identity. The Louvre isn't just a place to see a painting by Delacroix or David. Its very existence promotes the narrative of Paris as a cultural and artistic center. Art flows into Paris because Paris is a center of gravity that pulls art toward it. Paris thus becomes a place of high culture. It's positioned atop a social hierarchy of taste and sophistication. Museums remove art from daily life and employ it to promote narratives of national pride and to dignify imperial conquest. It's no coincidence that Italy became a unified nation in 1861, and shortly after, in 1873, the Statue of David moved from its place outside the palace, from its place as public art that everybody could see simply by walking around, and into the Galleria della Accademia, a museum. In this new context, the David doesn't serve a religious purpose, nor does it represent the scrappy city of Florence standing against would-be oppressors. Inside a museum, it serves only to tell the story of Italy's past, exhibiting the greatness of Italy's artistic past, as Dewey would say. It reminds everybody that so much of European art history was influenced by this little city in Italy. This is what museums do to art. They remove art from its context in daily life and employ it to serve the state. For this reason, Dewey calls museums the beauty parlor of civilization, and not in a flattering way. So that's the role that Dewey says imperialism played in removing art from our daily lives. But he also laments the ways that money has corrupted our experience of art. He says that generally speaking, the typical collector is the typical capitalist, who collects art to signify status. Dewey goes on to say that art collections reflect and establish superior cultural status, while their segregation from common life reflects the fact that they are not part of a native and spontaneous culture. And when art objects are segregated in this way, they get the title of, quote, fine art, and become disconnected from the natural experiences from which they were created. There was a time in European history when the production of paintings was dominated by the church and the nobility. During that time, paintings promoted the greatness of the church and the nobility. That was the work that art did in the world. Eventually, however, a merchant class wrestled artistic production away from those traditional forms of authority. This merchant class was able to make enough money that they could hire artists themselves, and when that happened, paintings began to serve a new master: money. And whenever I'm researching videos for this channel, I will inevitably come across some article in a major publication that treats the cost or sale of a particular work of art as relevant to its worth. Like works that sell for record-breaking numbers like Basquiat or Julie Moretu or Leonardo da Vinci are important seemingly because they sold for record-breaking numbers. It's such a stupid way to think about the importance of a work of art, to center the price paid for the object rather than the experience of encountering the object. One art object is not better than another art object simply because it sells for more money. The worth of an art object is not subordinate to its value in a capitalist system. And yet, these are the headlines I find. And that's how capitalism influenced the way that we perceive the role of art in our modern communities. So, nationalist and imperialist impulses push the work of art into museums that prop up narratives that center the nation-state, and capitalists turn the work of art into a signifier of social status, and both those trends removed art objects away from our daily life and put them into tiny elitist buckets that we call fine art. And when we confine our definition of art to that tiny bucket, we limit the work that art can do. The philosopher Richard Shusterman points out that the shrinking separation of art into fine art both reflects and reinforces a vicious division in modern society between practical labor, deemed to be intrinsically disagreeable, and aesthetic experience, held to be enjoyable but functionless. A division which too often manifests itself in painfully unaesthetic industry and uselessly irrelevant fine art. His point is that when we segregate art into museums, galleries, and the world of high culture, then we begin to see the spaces that we actually live in as exclusively functional, and at the same time, and in contrast, we begin to see the world of fine art as functionless, and this dichotomy, for lack of a better word, it sucks. It creates an ugly functional world, and it results in the production of useless art. I might add to that it also makes us think that art isn't doing its work anymore, that it is in fact functionless. But it's good to remember that from its position in museums, it does continue to do work on behalf of imperialist and capitalist values. So at this point, perhaps, I should give a counterexample. An example of a positive aesthetic experience built into the routines of modern life in the modern world in order to reveal what is possible. Something functional that isn't ugly. So let's discuss Grand Central Station in New York City. It has the architecture of a temple. As travelers enter, they encounter statues like this one featuring Mercury, the god of travel, with Hercules and Minerva, a symbol of strength and a symbol of innovation. Entering this temple, they experience the main concourse, which is huge in order to accommodate the mass of people, and the ceiling that they look up at illustrates the stars and their constellations. The connections between the celestial bodies that appear on that ceiling mimics the connection between the stations within the rail system. As above, so below. The visual art of the station matches the experience and purpose of the station. As somebody moves through this station, they move through history, from the classical-looking facade into the industrial mechanics of the subway or Metro North. Every part of the architecture of the station supports and mirrors the rhythms of the city, its commuter traffic, and the history of human connectivity and commerce. Its beauty and its function cannot be discussed separately. Grand Central Station is what a pragmatist philosopher would call an aesthetic experience. It's integrated into the flow of everyday life. Needless to say, I think that Dewey would really like Grand Central Station. The material space is organized in such a way as to force our attention on the rhythms of human mobility, commerce, and innovation. And with that, I think that we can now talk directly about what Dewey and other pragmatist philosophers mean when they refer to something as an aesthetic experience. So let's take a trip back to the Milan Cathedral. As we approach it, the first aspect of the architecture that we're going to encounter are those pointed spires and the multitude of statues that dot the ornate veneer. Each one carved in detail, even though most people are only ever going to see them from very far below. Each bit of stone speaks to the thousands of people who have worked to construct this building. It's impossible to look at this building and fail to understand or at least contemplate the massive collaboration across time and space that it required. Construction began on this cathedral in 1386, and it wasn't finished until 1965. You heard that correctly, 1965. And by the time it was finished, it needed repairs. So there is a strong argument that it's been under construction ever since 1386, and every generation employs more people in order to carry this structure forward into the future. When you go inside the cathedral, as with most cathedrals, your eyes get pulled forward toward the stained glass in the back, and then upward toward the ceiling. The arches literally point you toward the heavens. The architecture of the place points both your sense of sight and your thoughts upward toward the divine. But not only the divine. The statues and the images that you're going to find throughout this cathedral are of saints and stories specifically important to Milan, to the people and to the communities who have come together to build it and keep it going. And it doesn't stop there. The organ and the choir both fill this space with sounds from locations that you can't quite place if you're in it because the music bounces off all the hard surfaces of the interior. The sounds come from all around you, no single location. Every sound, every statue, every painting inside the building points us in the same direction. It points our thoughts to the idea that there is something greater than us, whether that be the Christian God worshipped in this location, or the community that has come together to construct this place for more than 600 years. Both are bigger than any individual. In the Milan Cathedral, our senses, emotions, and intellect all orient in that direction. We understand ourselves to be small, as part of something much bigger than us. The Milan Cathedral is an aesthetic experience. So let's break down what that phrase actually means and relate it to the understanding of pragmatism that we have from earlier. As a reminder, for Dewey and the pragmatists, understanding of the world is created through interaction with that world. Because we have biological needs, we can't help but interact with our surroundings, and by interacting with those surroundings, we change them. Knowledge and truth are not fixed or static, but they are dynamic and fluid. Dewey talks a lot about the, quote, live creature who interacts with his environment. The live creature needs food, for example, so he has to interact with the world to get food. In doing so, he's going to change the world, and the world will change him. Our experience of the world has these natural rhythms: hunger and satisfaction, desire and fulfillment, or desire and frustration, rejection and acceptance, or rejection and despair. You get the point. These are the rhythms of being alive. These are the narratives that life produces. But we hardly ever get to experience those rhythms without interruption. We hardly ever get a clean, cohesive experience of those rhythms. Between the desire for food and the satisfaction of eating the food, we will have countless unrelated thoughts and distractions. So for Dewey, an aesthetic experience is an uninterrupted, unified, cohesive experience that matches the rhythms of the live creature interacting with the world. It integrates our senses, emotions, and intellect and dissolves the boundaries between them. And so far, my examples have mostly been architectural, Grand Central, the Milan Cathedral. But the, quote, work of art is certainly not limited to architecture. A painting like The Procession to Calvary by Peter Bruegel does this really well with its depiction of cycles and suffering and guilt and sacrifice and selfishness. Paying attention to how all the diverse elements of that painting interact with each other, like the repetition of wheels, is a sensory, emotional, and intellectual experience all at once. But that's the topic of a different video. There's other examples. Sensitive engagement, for example, with a sporting event could be an aesthetic experience. Every action in a given game of soccer reflects the past events of that match and has an impact on the future events in that match. The sights, sounds, emotions, and strategy all align with the rhythms of individuals interacting with and participating in the world. In life, we don't know if a decision that we made yesterday is going to work out in the long term, but in an athletic competition, we will find out by the end of the match whether an individual decision had the intended long-term consequences. And an athletic competition is also a community experience. The audience all focus their attention and love in the same direction, and then they get fulfillment in some way or another by the final whistle. In all these cases, the aesthetic experience involves the creation of a unified and uninterrupted encounter with the world. A moment when sensory, emotional, and intellectual elements all come together harmoniously to match the natural rhythms of life. An experience like this illustrates the dynamic interplay between the, quote, live creature and their environment. Both are continually influencing and being influenced by each other. And if these kinds of experiences can happen at something as common as a sporting event, are they happening more than we actually think? The philosopher Richard Shusterman spends about half of his book, Pragmatist Aesthetics, arguing for the idea that everybody should feel as though they can participate in the world of art. He argues that when we create a distinction between the world of fine art and the world of popular culture, a distinction between the art that happens in museums and theaters and the art that integrates into our daily lives, then art ends up serving as a mode of oppression. He says that by drawing a sharp distinction between fine art and popular art can divide society still further into the privileged elite who tastefully appreciate it, and those others who may like art, but are not supposed to understand it properly. We all encounter art all of the time, but don't recognize the experience as art, because the art object isn't coded as fine art, or we don't believe the experience counts just because it's a Carly Rae Jepsen song. Shusterman wrote this book in the early 90s, so he hadn't seen Lindsay Ellis talk about the Transformer movies, or ContraPoints dig deep on Twilight, or CJ the X analyze a 30-second clip from Stranger Things for over an hour. If he knows about those videos, I'm sure he likes them, because all of those videos demonstrate the potential for aesthetic experience in popular art. How a work can be unified, cohesive, and complete, and still be popular. how thoughtful reflection on popular art can uncover the rhythms of the live creature and reveal something about the communities that produced it and appreciate it. They uncover the work being done by those popular art objects. And this reminds me of a John Green tweet that I like. I love Taylor Swift's music and lyrics. You don't have to, but I get to. The implication being that people withhold joy from themselves, or at least the potential for joy, when they construct a wall between what they consider art worth engaging with and art not worth engaging with. He allows himself the joy of aesthetic experience when listening to Taylor Swift. He gets to love Taylor Swift. But missing out on this joy is not the only consequence of dismissing the popular art of our daily experience as functionless or unworthy of our intellectual attention. It's also missing an opportunity to understand other members of our human community. Dewey and other pragmatist philosophers often link aesthetic experience to democratic participation. They argue that by looking at the art of other human populations, you can see the same rhythms of desire and fulfillment, hunger and satisfaction, loneliness and community, and so on. And by seeing how those rhythms map onto the experiences that may not be familiar to you, you can find a meaningful connection between yourself and the other. By engaging with the art of other individuals or other communities, there lies the potential for empathy and a sense of shared humanity. We can continue to dismiss popular art as quiche or unsophisticated and look down on the populations we see enjoying it. Or we can become curious. We can try to figure out what that work of art is doing for that community, and in doing so, better our understanding of the people that we share this space with. So thoughtful engagement with the world and reflection on aesthetic experience cultivates the exact habits necessary for a democracy. It requires open-mindedness and a willingness to understand the perspectives and tastes of others. It points our attention in a common direction and provides the foundation for discussion and democracy. By expanding our definition of art to focus on the experience of art, the literal work of art, and by dismantling the walls that separate fine art from popular art, the hope is that we can not only have more and better aesthetic experiences ourselves, but that we can become better, more empathic, and more sensitive citizens of our communities and the world. And that's where I think I'm going to end this one. Thank you for watching.